I recommend people that plan buildings where you need high availability of a sound system. Don't go to the cheapest offering because you may need a spare part 5-7 years later. You want to make sure you can get it.
So are there implications on the acoustic designs that typical CEOs are not aware of? I know, for example, you work with European customers, and in Europe, unlike America, you have buildings that are, hundreds of years old. Mm-hmm. We don't really have that in America. I imagine this whole acoustic game is very different in Europe. And so what are these challenges?
Well, how to frame it? As you're right, a lot of buildings in Europe have been designed by architects long before speakers were ever invented. And in Europe, we have a tendency of architecture built to impress. So the different churches were trying to build the most beautiful, the biggest, the most impressive church, to have the beautiful images in the sky and in the ceiling of the church to impress the people, to convey their message. These old architectural design did not take acoustics by speakers into consideration. But we have to say, even though they're a couple of hundred years ago, they did take into consideration the chorus, the singing, to create an effect on the reflection of the building, which is actually very impressive. I mean, if you go to Florence or to go to Rome and in St. Peter's Cathedral, it's impressive. And it still has this effect of impressing the person that coming into this church to witness the power and the strength of that. This is still there today, and I think it's amazing. Yeah, but then now we do have speakers, and those reflections, which are great when you have one singer or a group of singers at one spot, but not so great when you have them in different locations. So, as a rule of thumb, when you build a modern concert hall, like they build in Hamburg or modern places, you have professional acoustic planners that are really planning this out. And actually, there's always a conflict between the architect and the sound designer, because the architect doesn't want to see any speakers. But the sound designer says, if you don't give me something, I cannot produce anything. And so there is a huge or natural conflict, I have to say, between an architect, a light designer, sound designer. Yeah,
they all have different priorities.
They all have different priorities. And usually the sound designers are the last persons being asked. So meaning the architect builds a beautiful building, didn't consider this, then they try something, then they're unhappy, and then they ask the sound designer to help. Concert halls, a little bit different. Operas, they take this either in considerations, but when you consider like parliaments or train stations or airports, they all have the same issue. Yeah. So, then you have companies that have to find a good compromise for it and do this. And that's why these things are not so cheap. And that's why these big projects always have cost overruns. Or have you ever heard of any public, huge infrastructure place which were built within budget that was originally allocated?
Well, it's kind of like maybe they built the building within budget, and then they started talking to the sound designer and realized, oh, it's not correct.
Oh, lighting, the sound, the overrun, material not available, and people delays and so on. I heard like the Sydney Opera House, I think, only cost 7 times as much as they anticipated initially.
7?
7 times, okay. Yeah. Same happened to Hamburg and the Philharmonie building. I think it's a very common pattern, because if they would have set up an original budget which would be appropriate, they would never get the green light to go.
Oh. So they don't even try to have a realistic budget.
I don't think so. I think it's part of the strategy.
Yeah, sounds like it. So just like with special lighting, the power supply and the light design are intertwined and both are super important. Now with special acoustics, I know that the amplifier is kind of like first there's the speaker design and then the amplifier design are connected.
Yeah.
Can you share more about amplifier design, especially what are the considerations that some maybe entrepreneurs are not considering with amplifiers?
Yeah, amplifier is normally the box that you don't want to see, but we say no power, no tone, meaning you cannot have a sound without having some power driving the sound. So the amplifier that is converting the signal, the quality will impact the sound quality. Especially there's one figure that is commonly applied, it's called SNR, signal noise ratio. And you want to have more than 90 or some have 100 dBs difference. So because any electronics will still make some little background noise. Now there are different technologies, the older technologies using analog amplifiers. They used to have a higher power loss, and now we have Class D amplifiers that are usually applied in most of the consumer electronics now. But they also have some drawbacks when they're going over long distance because of the electromagnetic emissions that are coming along with it and interferences. But they are commonly applied. Now, more recently, we have some new semiconductor technology, gallium nitride technology, which allows for a higher efficiency. So you get more efficient power amplifiers, which in most cases mean the amplifiers get smaller, which is good because they use less real estate. However, each amplifier still needs to have a power supply. And if that power supply fails, your sound stops. So again, just like in lighting, the power supply is one thing that you still need. And in acoustics, you want to have, especially if the amplifier is in the same room as where you emit the sound, you do not want to have a noisy component.
Right.
Noisy part. So you don't want to hear a fan noise unless it's very noisy, then you can accept, but not in the quiet environment. And then we come back to this matter we discussed in the lighting field and power supply section. You have to think about your thermal design.
Wow.
Because also your power supply, your amplifier has components which will heat up, and you have to think about how do I deal with the heat, especially when you don't have easy ways to get rid of the heat.
Yeah. And so these are all compromises that the entrepreneur has to look at before they design the speakers.
Because of course, anything to deal with heat costs money, and people try to save money to maximize their margin, and then sometimes they go one step too far.
So I was just going to ask, related to money, what is let's say, the number one parameter that increases the price, but at the same time increases the longevity or the quality?
It's the same concept as in the power supply electronics. You need to maintain reasonable temperatures within your amplifier to extend the lifetime. And the next one, when you talk about the costs, there are very special audio ICs which deliver a really nice performance in terms of acoustic parameters, low noise, but these components are not so cheap because they're used in low quantities, which often leads to long lead times, which is another concern. So professional audio companies that we are familiar with, they often stock their critical ICs so that they don't have to wait for them, because the window of opportunity for them to do a sale is often shorter than the lead time window of the critical ICs that they need. So it's a mixed thing between supply chain, cost, performance, lead time, and because there's so many hundreds of brands, one of the key challenges in manufacturing is that your quantities are not that huge for the professional audio
Right.
equipment. Consumer, fine, no problem. But consumer products, again, as we discussed earlier, are also often not built to last for 20 years.
Yeah.
But when you do a building installation and the sound system is part of your building installation, you have to think ahead. You want to make sure that you can still maintain, supply, manage your system for decades. And that's why I recommend people that plan buildings where you need a high availability of a sound system. Don't go to the cheapest offering because you may need a spare part 5-7 years later. You want to make sure you can get it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, but it's, of course, nice thing is that although it's a fragmented industry, it still offers quite some value for people with skills. And if a young person asks me, shall I invest time in learning professional acoustics, I would say it's definitely worthwhile a skill to learn, because there will always be schools, there will always be churches, there will always be places where that know-how can be applied. And actually, when I talk to my customers, they tell me one of their hardest or the biggest challenges now is finding qualified staff.
Oh, like acoustic engineers?
Yeah, because acoustic engineering was kind of popular when Elvis Presley was there and when the Beatles were singing, and those times acoustic engineering was popular. But then the internet domain came and it became less popular. And now those people that were in the Rolling Stone times, they all retire now. And now they lack the staff that has the know-how and the experience and everything. So it's actually a reasonably well-paid job now in the West.
Okay. So for the audience watching, young people considering a career, acoustic engineering is going to be highly paid, I think.
Yeah, studios for public infrastructure, events,